Hi, my name is Nick Willis, and today I will be going over a research paper called How They Did It, which is an analysis of emission defeat devices in modern automobiles. So first, I'd like to start with some acknowledgments to the authors, Moritz Kantag, Guo Li, Andrei Pawlowski, Felix Domke, Kirill Levchenko, Thorsten Holz, and Stefan Savage. This is a group of researchers from Ruhr-Universität Bochum in Germany and University of California at San Diego. And they first presented this work at the 2017 IEEE Symposium on Security and Privacy, which was held in San Jose, May 22nd to May 24th in 2017. Since the topic of this paper is Volkswagen cheating on emissions testing, I wanted to go over some background about emissions regulations and emissions testing. What emissions regulations are in the US and Europe, vehicles have to meet pretty strict limits on toxins and particulate matter that leave the tailpipe. These regulations are enforced by bodies like the EPA and a European equivalent. And in order to ensure that these auto companies are complying with the regulations, there is a testing that is performed, which is standardized driving cycles on what they call a chassis dynamometer. This simulates real driving in a lab environment. You can see this picture here is what that setup looks like. Um, and while the car is simulating driving, they are measuring the amount of emissions leaving the tailpipe. Um, and then this paper also covers the use of defeat devices. And what a defeat device is a manufacturer can use some software to detect when an emissions test is occurring. We'll get into how they do that. But what this does, these defeat devices, is it alters the the engine performance during the time a test is detected to lower the amount of emissions leaving the tailpipe. And then when a test is not detected to be occurring, it reverts to higher emissions settings, which usually correlates with higher engine performance that consumers like to have. The motivation for the research I'm going over right now is the Volkswagen scandal that occurred in 2015. This is when Volkswagen was caught using defeat devices. This led to some major fines and recalls for that corporation. Um, and the researchers state that sort of the main motivation for their research was the complexity of vehicle software makes detecting defeat devices challenging and necessitates some advanced analysis techniques that the researchers developed over the course of their time studying the topic. And it gives technical insight into how these defeat devices operate and could be used to help inform future regulatory and compliance strategies. To give some more background on this Volkswagen scandal, it was unveiled on September 18, 2015. The US EPA issued a notice of violation to Volkswagen, which accused them of using defeat devices to circumvent emissions tests. Um, the defeat devices were used to detect when a vehicle was undergoing emissions testing and adjust engine behavior to pass the test while allowing higher emissions during normal driving. Um, It was found that emissions of nitrous oxides were 40 times the legal limit during regular use, even though they were passing testing. So this is the type of big difference you can see in emissions from test mode to regular driving mode. It's 40 times the nitrogen oxides, also called NOx. The scope of the cheating is estimated that approximately 11 million vehicles were on the road driving, creating more emissions than testing indicated. And this involved multiple models, including Audi, Porsche, and VW diesel vehicles. So this was specific to diesel engines. Gasoline engines were not involved in this scandal. The repercussions for Volkswagen for getting caught cheating on these emissions tests was large fines up to $30 billion. Senior executives were charged and prosecuted, and there was a lot of damage to Volkswagen's reputation and trust. I even show the stock price performance for 2015 for Volkswagen down below. You can see it was a bad year for the shareholders there. And larger than just Volkswagen, the company, this sort of led regulators to realize that they need to engage in stricter emissions testing and have more oversight and increase the scrutiny on other automakers too, revealing it was further revealed that other automakers were engaging in this type of emissions cheating with defeat devices as well. Now to get into some of the technical details of this Volkswagen defeat device and how it was implemented. During this talk, you'll hear me refer to acoustic condition or test mode kind of interchangeably. Acoustic condition is the term that Volkswagen used for test mode to sort of mask that they were trying to evade these emissions tests. Um, the acoustic condition is a set of logical conditions which determines if the vehicle is undergoing emissions testing or not. There's a state indicator for a specific variable. When it's at 0, it's normal driving mode. When it was a 1, it's in emissions test mode. The conditions to activate and have a 1 for the emissions test mode was coolant temperature, fuel temperature, oil temperature, atmospheric pressure, within these limits here on the table over at the right. And then test mode is activated when the engine starts. There's a set of conditions I'll get to later which deactivate test mode, but the default state is that the vehicle is determined to be in test mode when the car starts, because pretty much all times the car starts, you're within these parameters here. Logic implementation uses a flip-flop logic block to store and manage the state of the acoustic condition. Since the default mode for the engine is to be in test mode, and instead it relies on when certain deactivation conditions are met, it's put into regular driving mode. These conditions are that the vehicle exceeds a specific time and distance profile, engine speed exceeds a specific threshold, vehicle exceeds a velocity threshold, or the steering wheel angle deviates by more than 20 degrees from the neutral position. In later firmware, they observed this. The driving profiles and the conditions that the vehicle will be subjected to are known by the auto manufacturers, so therefore they know the set of driving conditions a test mode will occur in. When something occurs outside of that, the test mode is deactivated and the vehicle is put into normal driving mode. So what I'm showing here on the screen, specifically I'll point you to profile 9 on the right here, is these colored lines represent known emissions test profiles, test driving profiles, with the x-axis being time and the y-axis being distance traveled. And these are known driving profiles, and the white area represents the conditions in which the vehicle considers itself to still be in test mode. You can see they're trying to encompass a number of known test driving conditions. If at any time the vehicle time versus distance profile goes into these gray shaded areas for this profile 9, the vehicle will be considered to be in regular driving mode and thus in that higher emissions realm. So over the next few slides, I'll go over some of the engine performance parameters that are modified in a test mode versus a regular driving mode. First one we'll talk about here is exhaust gas recirculation. The purpose of this EGR is to reduce NOx emissions by recirculating a portion of exhaust gas back into the engine intake. When test mode is detected, more exhaust gas is recirculated. This results in a lower emission state. But when it's determined that the vehicle is in regular driving mode and this test mode logic is deactivated, the exhaust gas recirculation is lowered, and this increases engine performance. Another engine parameter that's modified based on test mode versus normal mode is the fuel injection timing, which is critical for controlling the engine power output, fuel consumption, and exhaust emissions. This is tracked in this Volkswagen software by this variable Q core, and it's adjusted based on whether the vehicle is in test mode or normal mode. In test mode, defeat device modifies Q core by adding a constant value that ensures compliance and lowers emissions. When in normal mode, the Q core is modified based on engine speed, and this optimizes for performance and efficiency, but at the cost of higher emissions. In addition to Volkswagen engines, the researchers also did look at another vehicle called the Fiat 500X. And the reason they looked at this one is accusations that surfaced in Europe due to discrepancies between road test data and regulatory compliance tests. So now we'll go over some of what they found when analyzing the Fiat 500X. What the researchers found when analyzing the Fiat system was a much more simple defeat device. So unlike Volkswagen's complex cycle, it relied on Fiat's defeat device relied on just timing, so it reduces the frequency of the NOx storage catalyst regenerations after a set period of engine operation. The reason they did this is because they know a test only lasts about 26 minutes. To describe what the defeat device was modifying, it was the what was called the NSC regeneration logic. The purpose of the NSC is to trap NOx during the loading phase, and during the regeneration phase, NOx emissions are reduced. The impact of regenerating is that it reduces fuel economy and increases diesel particulate filter load, so it requires more frequent filter changeouts. Frequent regenerations are necessary for effective NOx reduction. So the downside of an NSC type system that Fiat uses to reduce NOx emissions is that it requires frequent regeneration, which decreases fuel efficiency and increases loading on the diesel particulate filter, meaning that filter will need to be changed out more frequently. So the test cycle logic that was active during the first 1600 seconds had a higher regeneration frequency, and then after that period of time, the real driving logic took over and less frequent NSC regenerations occurred, which allowed for better fuel economy and less loading on the diesel particulate filter. The effect of the defeat device is it ensures vehicle passes emissions tests with the increased regenerations during testing, and then reverts to higher NOx emissions after the test is complete. It's a simple yet effective method to bypass the emissions regulations. And this kind of highlights the difficulty in detecting time-based defeat devices and emphasizes the need for continuous monitoring or advanced detection techniques to ensure compliance. So I'd now like to go over the different sources of data for this research. There are a number of files that were used in the analysis. First, start with the function sheets, and these function sheets document the functional behavior of a specific engine control unit firmware release. And these were obtained from tuner sites that are frequented by car enthusiasts. So they didn't get these files from an official source, but instead they had to go to forums and go to car enthusiast websites. Function sheets include block diagrams, explanatory text, and names of variables and calibration constants. And in the analysis, they were used to provide insight into how defeat devices are implemented and used to verify firmware code against functionalities that are documented. Another file that they used for the analysis is something called an A2L file. These describe the engine control unit variables and their addresses. And again, that's something that they had to go to a car enthusiast website to access, because typically these files are only available for people working on engine development at a car manufacturer. These are comparable to .map files that are used in software development for debugging. And the role in the analysis these served is to provide mappings of calibration constants to concrete addresses and to facilitate understanding of the engine control unit's inner workings. And the third main data source they used for this research were firmware images, which are binary files that represent the software running on the engine control unit. These were obtained from the tuning community again, but in some cases official repair sites as well. The role in the analysis that these firmware images provided is they're analyzed to identify and track the evolution of the defeat devices and provide raw data that was used for the static analysis with the tool CurveDiv that the researchers developed. And we'll talk more about CurveDiv later on. Now, there are two main analysis tools that were used in this research. The first one is IDA Pro, which converts binary firmware into a format that can be used for static analysis, and it's a disassembler that's used for generating and pre-processing firmware images. The second tool is one that the researchers developed just for this line of research. It's called CurveDiff. It's a static analysis tool that was developed to detect defeat devices in firmware images. It tracks driving profiles and checks against standardized test cycles, and it enables automated detection of defeat devices across multiple firmware versions. Now, to go into a bit more detail about what CurveDiff does is it focuses on detecting these Volkswagen-style, more complex defeat devices that compare driving profiles against standardized test cycles. It targets code regions in firmware that attempt to determine if a vehicle is undergoing an emissions test, and it analyzes whether the engine control unit's behavior is altered based on test cycle detection. I wanted to go over a typical workflow that was used while using the curve diff tool. There's 5 steps. There's pre-processing, which generates and pre-processes IDA Pro database. The second step is lifting to the SSA form, which converts firmware to a static single assignment form for efficient data flow analysis. The third step is curve function analysis, which identifies calls to a specific curve function to check driving profiles against test cycles. Fourth step is relating curve queries, which groups related curve queries based on the same input variable and distinct curves. And lastly is step 5, matching test cycles, which extracts and normalizes curves from the firmware and then matches these curves against known emissions test cycles to identify potential defeat devices. So for the performance that the researchers found while using the curve diff tool, they typically were able to analyze a firmware image in about 2 minutes each on average. They detected potential defeat devices in 406 of the 924 images that they analyzed, and they found that 66% of these images affected exhaust gas recirculation, with 92% of them influencing actual EGR parameters. So to kind of go back over again what curve diff does, it provides a faster, more reliable method to detect sophisticated defeat devices, and it kind of highlights the need for advanced software methods to keep up with evolving defeat device strategies in these Volkswagen type of systems. For the more simple Fiat type defeat devices, you don't need this more detailed analysis. So to give a recap of the Volkswagen case study portion of this research, Volkswagen uses a complex defeat device that uses environmental parameters to detect if an emissions test is occurring and then alters the engine behavior to reduce emissions if a test cycle is detected. It uses steering wheel checks that checks that if the angle of the steering wheel is greater than 20 degrees. If the steering wheel angle goes greater than 20 degrees, then it rules out being in test mode. And it changes the EGR parameters, the exhaust gas recirculation. It reduces NOx emissions during tests by increasing exhaust gas recirculation, and that has increased particulate matter production as a trade-off. Now, to contrast the Volkswagen case study with the Fiat case study, where the Fiat case study used a simpler mechanism, it just did a mechanism where it reduces the frequency of NSC regenerations after 26 minutes and 40 seconds. In the NSC regeneration logic, it was active the test logic was active in the first 1600 seconds with more frequent regenerations, and then after that, the real driving logic kicked in and allowing for more NOx emissions by limiting the NSC regenerations after that initial test period. Regulatory implications here are it highlights challenges in detecting these simple time-based defeat devices, and it suggests the need for longer test cycles. It illustrates the diverse methods manufacturers use to bypass emissions regulations by looking at the Fiat case versus the Volkswagen case, that there's more than one way to implement a defeat device, and emphasizes the evolving sophistication and variety of defeat devices used in the automotive industry. Some of the limitations of this research approach that was used in the paper we've been discussing is it has a focus on test cycle detection. So this curve diff tool primarily detects defeat devices that match driving profiles to test cycles. So it may miss defeat devices that use other parameters or more sophisticated detection methods. It relies on static analysis, which cannot easily execute firmware images, and it limits dynamic behavior understanding. It may not detect more passive defeat devices. It relies on quality data being available. For this research, covered earlier that they were relying on these tuner websites to give them function sheets and these A2L files, so it's not a verified data source. Thus, the authenticity of this data can't be verified, and it could affect the analysis accuracy. And it has some scalability issues. So some of their running some of their analysis, they did time out on some of these tests, and so there would need to be an optimization to handle large scale firmware analysis. So, lastly, to summarize what we've covered here, uh, this analysis found that there was widespread use of defeat devices. In 924 of the firmware images that were analyzed, 406 were found to contain defeat devices. Both Volkswagen and Fiat Chrysler used mechanisms to bypass emissions tests, although these methods were different. So Volkswagen had a more complex cycle detection and used car driving and steering wheel parameters to determine whether a test was ongoing or not. And Fiat used just a timer-based mechanism. Uh, and both of these defeat devices adjusted their behavior to have an effect on the emission control system. So parameters like exhaust gas recirculation and NSC regeneration were changed by whether a test cycle or a regular cycle was detected. Ultimately, this leads to increased NOx emissions during real-world driving, and these defeat devices fool testers so that they have a hard time enforcing regulation. And that's all we have for today. Thank you.